Good afternoon, Tony. Thank you for being with the St. Louis Press Club, our initiative called Hour in the Now. It is September 23rd. So please introduce yourself. Tell us what you do.
My name is Tony Messenger. I am the Metro columnist at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And I'm coming to you today from my alternative office. It's a beautiful day. And I'm sitting outside on the deck and working on my laptop out here. So there's no rain in the forecast, and hopefully the dogs don't bark too much, and this will work just fine.
That's great. So when we invited you to be a part of this, it was in the context of COVID. It was in the context of the George Floyd murder. I'm going to add one more thing to this. I guess about a year and a half ago, you won this little prize called the Pulitzer Prize. Congratulations again. I'm sure you've gotten many of those congratulations and you know, wonderful recognition for this prize. We're all prideful, of course. But in the context of all that's happened this year, you know, there's pressure, of course, I'm sure for you, but in the context of all that's happened this year, has that prize in any way positioned you differently to do what you do?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's different is in part because of the prize and the work that led to the Pulitzer. I am working on a book. It's going to come out hopefully next fall, published by St. Martin's Press, called The Price of Poverty. And it is about the unfortunate practice of debtors' prisons, not just in Missouri, but all across the country, where poor people end up stuck in jail because of fines and fees implemented to them on the court system. And one of the things I get into in the book is the history of how this happened. And it happened because state lawmakers are looking for backdoor taxes to raise revenue. And judges and others in the criminal justice system have let them do it. So I've been working on that while I've been, you know, working on columns and everything else. And so, you know, that's been a wonderful opportunity and a good challenge because I haven't written a book before, and it's a completely different sort of animal than writing daily columns. But I'm excited about the opportunity to hopefully take that work that was primarily local and make it more of a national voice.
It's interesting, the term debtor's prison. I mean, it's a very old term, and you enlivened it. You enlivened it with your series of columns regarding this awful thing that was happening to poor people, especially. So again, later, there was talk about bringing this back again. I guess it was this year in May. I mean, what was your reaction when you heard there were behind-the-scenes meetings that wanted to, that were discussing bringing this practice back?
Yeah, there was an amendment in the state legislature earlier this spring in which last year's bill that passed that made it illegal to try to threaten to put people in jail if they couldn't afford their previous jail board bill, the bill that people in rural Missouri get after they spend time in jail. There was a movement to reverse it, and they didn't have a hearing, and they didn't file a standalone bill. A state senator just put it on the back of another piece of legislation and tried to sneak it through. And luckily, the Attorney General's office was paying attention and noticed it, and told the sponsor of last year's bill, Representative Bruce DeGroat from Chesterfield, and he let me know about it, and I wrote about it, and they quickly reversed course and knocked that amendment out of the bill. But I have no doubt, it's one of the things I write about in the book, I have no doubt that there will be a further attempt to reverse that legislation, similar to what you see all over the country in a pushback from the law enforcement community and from the bail bonds industry to bail reforms that both courts and legislatures are imposing for similar reasons, because we're using the court system to financially penalize poor people, not necessarily using bail to keep the community safe, which is what its constitutional purpose is. And there is massive pushback every time state of New York, state of California, various cities have imposed those types of reforms. We're seeing it here in Missouri. Then the legislature and the law enforcement community pushes back. And so that push and pull is not going to go away, because the sheriffs and the small rural counties that have lost their tax bases, they want their revenue. And they won't get it by asking their taxpayers for an increase. And so putting it on the backs of poor people, and then being able to say to your voters that you didn't raise a tax, that's what they try to do. And I have no doubt they'll be back again next session.
So your work is never done as a journalist, as an investigative journalist, as a columnist. You put out 4 columns a week, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So what does it take to do that? Talk about your support system.
Well, I probably work too much, but the reality of the column is that in many ways it is a relationship with my readers. And so one column often begets another column. And that's the sort of thing that, I'll give you an example. I wrote a column sometime in the last week now on a woman named Latasha Johnson. She lives in Clinton Peabody Public Housing in South St. Louis, south of downtown. And she had emailed me about just the reality of dealing with daily gunfire in St. Louis. And I used that as a column about how none of the things that she thinks would help reduce violence in St. Louis are the things that state lawmakers were talking about in Jeff City. Complete disregard, disconnect between what people on the street think might help them and what state lawmakers, particularly rural Republicans, are talking about. I met Latasha a few years ago when I wrote a column about a landlord-tenant dispute that she was in. And she was the plaintiff in a case that went all the way to the Missouri Supreme Court. So as I write these columns 4 times a week, I develop relationships with different people in the community. And often I get to tell stories of those people's lives again, because they end up having a resonance in a new story that's going on. I wrote a COVID-19 column about a woman named Melissa Golder, who I had written a column about years ago because she founded a nonprofit to help fundraise for Black students from the city of St. Louis who attend schools in the Rockwood school districts as part of the voluntary inter-district transfer program. And she ended up getting COVID, and I wrote a column about that as well. And so I love having those sorts of relationships that lead to other relationships. And that keeps my email box full with lots of folks having ideas to write columns about.
Mm-hmm. So what about the actual relationship with St. Louis Post-Dispatch? Editors, what have you? How does that all work in connection with you?
Right. So I have an editor, Marcia Koenig, and she occasionally assigns me columns. I email with Marcia and other editors, Gilbert Bailon, the editor of the paper, all the time about various things, and stuff comes across their desk and they'll say, hey, are you interested in this? And so I definitely get ideas from my editors. My column is very rarely assigned from my editors. I think they agree with me that it works best being a column that sort of comes from the ground up. And so I get, lots of tips, and I share them with my colleagues. And there are times when I use my column to break news. There are times when I get a tip through some of my sources, and I share it with a reporter on a particular beat, and they break the news on the front page, and I might write a column as some sort of a follow-up on the same topic or a similar topic. So it's interesting, as a journalist, I've always been a little bit of a loner, and I think that sort of fits for a Metro columnist. I sort of,
you know, I have the best job in the world. I get to write about what I want to write about. And I focus a lot on social justice issues, but I'm not limited to that. And so if I want to write about youth sports, I'm writing a column on youth sports in the next couple of days, and I do that every now and then. Then I decide to do that. And so there's a tremendous amount of freedom, but my colleagues and I are sharing, you know, tips and ideas on things all the time.
This notion of localism, how important that is. Of course, your column speaks to that. You have been, you've been a writer for a weekly. I mean, you've been in a lot of different positions in the business. You must have feelings for what has happened in the last year with regard to journalism, especially local entities, local models, business models.
Well, I'm constantly worried about the state of the industry because our financial model is in flux. All newspaper countries or companies all across the country are facing various financial pressures and trying to find new models that work for them. There are folks playing with a nonprofit model as a possible future. There are folks like Jeff Bezos coming in and investing in major daily metro newspapers and possibly taking us back to that day of Pulitzer ownership and individual family, you know, sort of ownership. So I'm constantly worried about that. But for me as a journalist, as those things are happening, you know, I try to make them noise as much as possible and just focus on doing the work because the journalism has to survive. And you mentioned my roots are in small newspapers. I started in the tiniest of little weekly newspapers. And when you started a newspaper like that, where every single day you're writing about your neighbors and your kids' teachers and the people that you're going to see at the grocery store and the coffee shop, it affects your perspective on journalism and how personal it is and how impactful it can be, both positively and negatively, in people's lives. And so that sort of experience drives me. And a good example, you know, the Post-Dispatch is a regional newspaper. It's a metro newspaper. It's a national newspaper sometimes, maybe not as much as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, but folks across the nation still look at our headlines and in terms of the types of big stories that we cover. When a national story like the coronavirus pandemic happens, and every media outlet in the world is covering it, what rises above what really matters is localized coverage. So you look at not just the columns that I'm writing on COVID, but all of my colleagues at the Post-Dispatch, we're covering this national story through the very real eyes and words of local doctors and healthcare professionals and politicians and families who are losing loved ones and who can't be with their loved ones as they're dying in hospitals in isolation. We're telling those stories, and that takes that national story and makes it very much a local one. And that's happening all across the world, not just in St. Louis.
So you're living up to what I guess Joseph Pulitzer did when he wrote that Cradle, the platform.
Yeah.
Which of course still say, I know the original one is in the old building now, but there's still a copy of it, yes, in the new building.
Oh, yes.
We haven't been very much lately, but nonetheless, the words resonate from that, about racial justice, about reform, social justice, all those things. I think Joseph Pulitzer would be very proud. And certainly with your story on the debtors prison, that did win the prize. That really does live up to this moral compass that we were holding here. Why do you think, I mean, I agree with you that the paper's done such a superb job with regard to local coverage. But there are still those snobs who just, you know, don't think reading the local newspaper is important. What's that all about?
Well, I mean, you know, part of it's changing technology, and you know, we're doing our best, like so many other newspapers and media outlets, to fix that to address that technology. I mean, a year ago I wasn't doing Zoom meetings, and now I'm doing a lot of Zoom meetings, and you know, It's just the way that the world is changing. You know, part of the problem, and it's a national political problem, and it really is problematic and difficult to deal with and distressing sometimes, is when the president of the United States and many of his followers adopt as a strategy a constant attack on the free press. And not just a rhetorical, oh, the press is liberal, which is something that, you know, Republicans have been saying for a long time, often without evidence. These are serious attacks. This is the president of the United States saying that we are the enemy of the people. This is the president saying, every time he's criticized, saying, don't listen to, and he names the outlets and he names the reporters. This is the president of the United States just the other night at a campaign rally, getting his people to cheer a television reporter getting shot by rubber bullets by police and suggesting that that is a good thing. It is the most un-American, you know, concept imaginable, and yet that's our reality right now. And so there are going to be a large segment of folks in this country who have become part of the president's tribe for whatever reason, and they're going to listen to that, and they're going to believe that. And so they're not going to read the local press. They're going to click on a Facebook post that may or may not be encouraged by Russian spies. And that's where they're going to get their news sometimes, and they're going to continue to disparage the press. We have to get beyond this, and I think we will. I mean, you know, politics traditionally swings in a pendulum, and sometimes it's fast and sometimes it's slow. I hope this particular period in our history swings very quickly, and we can get back to the press not being the enemy, but the press being the voice for truth that is depended upon by citizens to help be watchdogs on our government, whether our government be run by Democrats or Republicans. People locally know that is the case. They see our work being very critical of both Democrats and Republicans, and being watchdog journalists on administrations that are run by both Democrats and Republicans, and they recognize that we see that as our job, and we don't pay attention to those political labels when we're doing that kind of work. But to overcome that over a period of time while the president continues to act as though the press is the enemy of the people, it's a problem, and it's going to take a while for our country to recover from this.
Yeah, journalists are under siege. There's no question. It's a democracy issue. I think that's really key here, and what journalists are trying to safeguard, certainly, when they do their jobs. And the jobs can be dangerous, my goodness. What's it been like when, I mean, are you out in the field much, especially, okay, there's COVID, and then we had so much of the unrest in the community. Right. What's that been like for you personally?
So I have not been in the field that much. I've probably in the last 3 or 4 months been out 8-10 times in terms of doing some in-person reporting when I went to some homeless camps when the mayor was trying to get rid of some of the tent encampments downtown. And had some interviews with some business people that struggled with COVID and some individuals that have been dealing with that. And so I've had a variety of, you know, a handful of those moments where I thought I really needed to be out in the community. But for the most part, I've been trying to follow the rules as much as everybody and isolate. And I've got a couple of underlying conditions that are, you know, a little bit worrisome for COVID. So I, you know, worry about trying to protect my own health and my family's health. And so, you know, I've been working a lot from right here on my deck and in my basement office or on the kitchen table. I move around and try to, just have a little different atmosphere every day. My kids are upstairs, hopefully on their Zoom classes right now at school, because their school is still in both of their schools are still in virtual learning situations. So I've been doing a lot more work from here, and it's awkward because I miss being out in the community, and I'm grateful for a lot of my colleagues who are taking those risks and doing a lot of still very much on the street reporting. I've been doing a whole lot more from here, and hopefully my column hasn't suffered too much because of it.
Well, you spoke to one of the abilities to stay home, your contact list, your sources, your constant email connections, et cetera, et cetera. So that goes to the territory of seasoned reporter who has gained trust. That trust factor is so much a key element in the relationship between audience and journalists. Can you speak to that, please?
It is, and to get back to that previous topic about the president talking to about the press as the enemy of the people. I've long spent a lot of my career covering politics, and I used to cover the Capitol and state government, and so I've dealt with Republicans and Democrats at a very high level historically during my career, particularly here in Missouri, and this is becoming a very odd time where those sorts of relationships aren't the same as they used to be. Because you're not running for office as a Republican right now, for the most part, if you aren't on the Trump train. And that means being on the Trump train 100%. It doesn't mean you can have a foot dipped out, and that's the reality. And so that's affecting, some of my historic relationships with sources in that party. And I don't know what's going to happen after November 3rd. If there is a change in the White House, and if this moment of our history with Trumpism fades or becomes something else, how it affects those previous relationships. Do Republicans jump off the Trump train and try to convince people like me, well, that was all just a big joke and we had to do it, and whatever, and to hell with the 200,000 people who have died from COVID-19. I think there's going to be a really weird time, no matter what happens on November 3rd. But if the pendulum swings back and the Republican Party comes back to being something that is a little bit more mainstream, that relationship, that damage that's been done on behalf of the president between that party and the press is going to take some rebuilding, and it's not going to be that easy.
Yeah, and all this reckoning now with race relations, talking about systemic racism, institutional racism. There's a lot of walking the talk. How long is that going to last also? I've wondered about that. I'm sure you have too. How long will this be? Is it sustainable, everything we've gone through this year? From a societal and institutionally with journalism?
Well, I think, when you look at the civil rights movement, you go back and you look in the 60s and the 70s, how long change took before major national legislation passed. We're still in the infancy. I tie this new civil rights movements to August 9th, 2014 in Ferguson, when Michael Brown was shot and killed. And George Floyd represents a completely new chapter 6 years ago, or 6 years later, that has both elevated and changed that particular movement, and made Black Lives Matter all of a sudden mainstream, where we see it on basketball courts as we're watching the NBA playoffs at night, and where the NFL, which used to eschew the phrase, has now adopted it and at least to some degree embraced it. And so the world has changed, but we're still changing, and we're still in an ever-changing movement. Just today, the Louisville, Kentucky district attorney, or the attorney general for the state, announced a single charge in the Breonna Taylor killings, and not for actually killing Breonna Taylor, but the one officer who was charged for shooting wildly into the next door apartment. By the way, white people lived there. I suspect we're going to have some intense protest over the next couple of days in Louisville, and you know, again, bring more attention to the movement. And so you brought up those two phrases. I'm actually in the middle of a column that will probably run Sunday that talks about institutional racism and systemic racism, and explains it in a way. What does it mean and what does it look like? Well, the answer to the question is we still have those things embedded into our system here in St. Louis and all over the country. And until we've actually taken some steps to fix systemic racism and fix institutional racism and not just talk about them, then we're still going to be talking about them for a long time.
I want to ask you at this point if you'll show up at the press club with your new book.
I sure hope so. I sure hope so. I'm in the process of being edited and going through all of that fun stuff, and it's a new experience, but I'm excited about it, and I look forward to hopefully the vaccine coming out before the book does, and you know, being able to do some proper book tours and signings and all of that sort of thing.
Terrific. Our series is called Hour in the Now. Just a few days ago, Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. It's been hard on a lot of people. She represented all these things that you like to talk about in your columns. Can you address that for us, please?
Well, you know, I think obviously that Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death is a massive loss for the nation. It's a massive loss for democracy. I chose to write a column about a unanimous ruling that she authored that was issued last year on this idea of fines and fees. It was the first decision in which the U.S. Supreme Court said that the excessive fees clause in the Eighth Amendment clearly applies to states, not just the federal government. I think that decision is going to have a massive effect on this concept of debtors' prisons that are operating under the radar in states all across the country. And I was heartened by the fact that that ruling was unanimous. Not every Supreme Court ruling is 5-4. And that one being unanimous was one of the ways that I chose to remember Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But clearly her death is going to have an effect on the election. And there is going to be another difficult fight over her replacement that will likely be nominated in the next couple of days by President Trump, and more than likely confirmed by the Republican-controlled Senate. So it will change the makeup of the court. And for the folks who are bothered by the current makeup of the court, the only way for that to change at some point is to elect a different president and elect a different Senate, and let them do their work over a period of time.
And voting is so important, of course.
Yeah.
So finally, some predictions for journalism in the next year or two. Well, what do you foresee? What do you think technology, you addressed technology earlier. Do you think newer technology will probably come, to be used more now than before? What are you thinking about the role of journalists, technology, audience? How's that going to look in the year or two?
I don't know what, and it's so hard to make a prediction right now as it relates to this coronavirus pandemic is having such a massive effect on everything that we do and everything that the business community in multiple industries does, that I just don't know. I mean, I expect that we're still going to have some other difficult economic shoes that are going to drop in the next several months, both pre and post election, related to COVID-19, related to what appears to be at least somewhat of an ongoing recession in the country. And I think those sorts of pressures might make it difficult for newspapers to make the progress that they ultimately need to make to reclaim an important part of American democracy. But I believe this. I believe journalism is going to survive, and I don't know what it's going to look like in another 20 years. It looks different today than it did 20 years ago. I've been doing this a little bit more than 30 years now, and it's you know, every decade it's something that's a little bit different. But people still depend on us to tell their stories, and they're going to depend on us 20 years from now to tell their stories in some capacity, whether we're Zooming them or still using a notebook and pencil and paper. And so we're going to survive. Our democracy demands that we survive. I hope voters appreciate the role of the free press in democracy and sort of reinvigorate us perhaps by some of their choices on November 3rd.
I will leave it at that, Tony, on behalf of the St. Louis Press Club. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Be well, continued success, and of course, we'll watch out for the book.
All righty. Thanks, Jessica. Good to talk to you. Bye-bye.
Good to talk to you.